last week I forgot to record. Well, I didn't forget. I just didn't have hosting capabilities for whatever reason. Anyway, this week's topic is, what do we mean by autonomous? We're talking about DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. And so the topic is, what do we mean by autonomous? For some people, it means that the different cells, I mean, for me personally, it means that the different cells in the organization are able to function without necessarily always being connected. And that's kind of a holochain type of view of things. For other people, autonomous means you don't need humans, that code is law, and the DAO is going to function for itself. So that's today's topic. And I guess we should just start by what people think about what autonomous is. And then if there's some particular reason that they're here or some particular question they want to answer for themselves as well.
Is it okay if I go first? Oh, sorry.
If you can just repeat what you said about holochain. I didn't get that reference.
Well, holochain's idea of autonomy, right, is if you're using a holochain app and one node goes offline for a while, it can still function and the rest of the chain still functions. So each node would have its own autonomy, and then my own data would be autonomous. So things can function autonomously from one another. And I think about that again in terms of Judaism. It's like we don't have a pope. Each synagogue functions as its own autonomous organization, and we all belong to this thing, but there's a level of autonomy. Or Al-Qaeda on the other hand, right? There's these autonomous things, and if you kill one cell, you haven't killed Al-Qaeda. So those are that's what I mean by autonomy. But a lot of people in the blockchain space mean the thing functions no matter what happens, it's immutable, and code is law. So yeah, Michal, go ahead.
And that actually, relates very closely, because my last 5 minutes before the call thinking about the stuff and checking on what's the topic is that it might be actually a misnomer, at least from my perspective, because this autonomous property, and recently I was just looking for more books about blockchain and other stuff, is basically, decentralized property. So you kill off, like one head, but the rest of the network still survives. So, like based on systems language, or basically, software, from software computing point of view, that's a decentralized or distributed system. There is nothing about autonomy there. So two of the things that I thought about is, probably related to the theory of the firm. That's one thing. And the other one is related to ownership. Because if it's autonomous, it's much easier to deal with, basically coordinate transaction costs that we had no other better means to deal with before than, let's say, doing organizations, hierarchical organizations. So like the way the autonomous that I see is to basically help a lot of humans to coordinate better. So that's one thing. And the other, as I said, it's kind of, like ownership. Yes, like we're citizens. Yes, we can be shareholders, or we can be stakeholders, but probably this autonomous organization can also empower us as owners or co-owners. So that's probably, like the other powerful tool. And, like the last one, purely related to a company, I might have mentioned that before. If I have an autonomous car that is driving for me, probably I don't want to check every single time who gets in and what kind of rates they pay or whatever else. I want this automated. So this, like this autonomous organization can be basically, like a new iteration on what the firm or company or business can be. So, those are kind of like my key thoughts from a few minutes back. And Grace, you're on mute.
Well, I'm basically asking who else wants to talk, so that's all I have to say.
Okay, I'll try. Of autonomy, many respects, necessarily it's not necessarily that you are dealing with a central brain. I mean, the whole model of mind and limbs historically was that you had one central mind and multiple limbs, certainly in a legal sense. What we now know from biology is that, in fact, intelligence is distributed in multiple places and in fact, most of the limbs are intelligent as well, have intelligence in them. And intelligence is far more a bottoms-up property than it is a top-down property. So I think a lot of questions need to be asked about what autonomy means, what independence means, what is connected to what, and along the example of cutting things off, are we really more like an octopus, which is perfectly okay when you cut off one of the tentacles, it can regrow one and therefore organically keep on developing. So I think it's autonomy and change, I think, are kind of connected, and together with independence.
Welcome, Will. We're talking about what the autonomous and decentralized autonomous organization means.
Awesome.
Eyal, did you want to say something? We're just kind of sort of going around and each one of us is saying something about how we feel about that, and then we'll see what's next.
Sure, yeah, I'll give it a try. I just wanted to say, I think octopi, they don't grow their limbs back. Those are starfish, and octopi get too much credit anyway. So
it's only certain species of starfish, not all species of starfish.
Yes, that's true as well. So yeah, regenerative qualities are amazing. So I think I sort of agree with Michal about that mediation function, right? That we just want that mechanism, that code to help us interact better. And for me, the DAO, like this whole new organizational idea, is sort of like to change the power dynamics. So to change the politics, the mechanics of politics, and to have an organization that's able to sustain itself without a single person making it their cause, which is often the case until you get to an IPO. And for me, the question is what is autonomous? Who is autonomous in this question? And I think it needs to be the individual. And what we're sort of lacking, and for me, again, like Michal said, is sort of like that part of immutability. That's what's important for us to have the market, because we're always talking about the market, like it exists, like there's something out there that is actually the market, that we need to interact with each other, and that's supposedly very efficient and very fair. But with blockchain, with immutability, with this stuff, perhaps we could really build that machine that is the market that we can all rely on and interact with reliably, and be more autonomous in the world through that.
Cool. Will, do you want to say something about that?
Sure. Yeah. We've always been pushing this like protocol level kind of ish thing. So, hoping that the smallest unit in the network can be intelligent enough to sort of run itself and choose how it wants to interact with other cells, and to create sort of emergence economies around that. Like doing that practically is a lot more challenging though, and also there's a lot of things around the technological space as well that like you get locked into centralization, or you get locked into payment rails or roadblocks, and like the telecom, for instance. Like if you want to get people to all be able to access an interface, but you have to do it through a telecom, then you know what I mean. There's always these like choke points that you run into, and I feel like that's just the story of life right now for me, is pushing towards that sort of decentralized infrastructure that like communities can sort of grow around, and not trying to define community either. It could be a municipality, it could be a church group, it could be a village, it could be an economic stuff. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. I think this realm is super interesting, and I really appreciate listening to you all.
Welcome, Kalia. We are all just going around. Today's discussion is about what does it mean autonomous when we talk about decentralized autonomous organizations. So we've actually all said at least something. So if you want to say something, or if you want to like wait a few minutes till you settle in before you say something, however you feel comfortable.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not really sure what I think autonomous means, so I'll just pass. And I don't know if it's okay, but I have a standing call at the top of the hour every 2 weeks. So if it's okay, I'll stay. But if it bothers you that I leave early, then I'll go.
We don't have any rules like that. The fundamental rule of this organization is that any proposal that doesn't have any material objections to it is accepted. And I don't think anybody has any material objections to someone leaving at the top of the hour.
Great.
In fact, that's pretty common. A lot of people can only be here for the first hour. So welcome. Yes, so it's really interesting. I wrote a few notes as well as doodling as we were talking, but it's really interesting because I personally don't connect to this like new business model thing in some ways, and then in other ways it really brings up this idea for me. And I had this conversation with this guy Yuri from Antwerp, who's come up with this idea of. And the idea that he's working with like student housing cooperatives right now and other things, and he's trying to implement something similar to donut economics. And his idea is around the problem with organizations and companies and brands is that we develop this attachment to something that doesn't exist. And Al alluded to this, like markets don't exist. And he said, and so he created this whole system of nonprofits, I think foundations, that own companies, and he gives them names that are unpronounceable in any language. So he uses letters so that they would be able to register it as a limited thing. And then in the group, they just call it by a number, like company number 1, company number 2, and they spin it up when they need it for whatever project is, and then they spin it down when it's done its lifetime, so that nobody gets this attachment to a brand. And it's more like a project-oriented thing. Like, okay, if we need a legal entity, we have this legal entity, and then when it's over, it's over. And then whatever profits there are, whatever outcomes there are, he's also looking at human outcomes. So for example, in the area of student housing, what you would do with profit is you'd buy another student housing unit so that more humans would be served for it. Like the human happiness is one of his measures. And the only way to measure to increase human happiness over a certain level of ecstasy is to have another human also be happy. And so he has this kind of like these temporary organizations so that you don't get attached to it. And I really like that. I really feel that it's really intelligent to say, okay, like these companies, these businesses, and even the market, like as I was mentioning, it doesn't exist. It's just a figment of our imagination. It's being utilized for a particular purpose, and when that purpose is over, we should retire it. And I really don't like the idea of immutability. I think it's very unnatural. In natural systems, things die and decompose and become something else. And a company really, it isn't a thing. And money isn't a thing. It's not a thing. It's just it's a tool that we use, and when it's done, we should throw it out. And I actually think that's one of the problems with blockchain. You can never get rid of it, even when you're like, you know what, this project is over, let's close it. You still have this thing running. It's like, like Namecoin. Or these DAOs that are in DAO stack that you can never kill because they're still there. There's all these ghost DAOs because it's immutable. Nobody thought things that become alive should also die. I mean, that's just the way of things. Anyway, that's my comments on some of the ideas around autonomy. Yeah.
Why has nobody done?
You're gonna have to unvideo yourself, Joop, when you speak.
What has nobody done doing for DAO? You know, if you bring something into life, you immediately, in principle, plan for it being killed off, undoing whatever you've done. And so it's kind of illogical for a fairly well-structured thinking group of people to never have planned for the undoing. Is there no example of that?
Well, I mean, this is what the whole, like the Ethereum rollback, right? That whole DAO, you know, the original DAO disaster was about. Like, we couldn't immutable it, so we had to fork it. And yeah, it's.
But we can, now that we have been through that experience, I would have thought that at least some people would have tried to, for a DAO which has programmed into it its dissolution. I mean, you know, in many respects, you know, most countries now have bankruptcy laws specifically in order to have an ordered undertaking. You need to create, or there needs to be order at the moment of creation, and you need to have order for killing off, you know, inanimate life. I mean, you know, just like animate life naturally dies, animate life needs to be killed off, and to free the resources for other purposes.
I mean, what's so fascinating about what you said is, wouldn't a bunch of intelligent people recognize that this was a screw up and fix it? And I'm like, huh, right? Nobody has done that. Not for DAOs, not for blockchains, not for anything.
Well, that's one constructive thing that has come out of this meeting. We can clearly move the art further ahead by at least coming up with an undoing project. So that's good. Other people, what do you think?
I think there are some like few very different, interesting thoughts that are kind of turning esoteric for me. So one thing, since Kalia joined, you know, like maybe the autonomy is not really the whole goal. So that it's just, you know, like works by itself. It's about self-sovereignty. So it can manage itself, whatever happens with the external environment. And then, you know, like the whole discussion now about DAOs and automating things, you know, like it's this organic properties versus, let's say, mechanistic properties. Because Grace, you said that, you know, like company is not a real thing. I mean, like it's a kind of like a thing, but it's an artificial construct. Kind of, yeah, like robots are artificial constructs, and they don't have life yet. But with the story of this paperclip maximizer, which is a cautionary tale for DAOs, you know, like the paperclip maximizer would just try to kind of survive like life, right? So yeah, from our point of view, it might be better to have some kind of a kill switch. But on the other hand, you know, why we could have so much software and DAOs, because it's just so much easier to create, you know, those artificial forms that they just persist, right? They don't have to eat, they don't have to hunt, you know, they don't have to have, you know, like habitat, they just live somewhere else, which again, turns very weird. And one more thought, you know, about immutability. I'm thinking that, you know, for blockchain immutability, yeah, it's important, but the key point there is that you have this kind of a chain that you see how things transform. And again, comparing that to the organic world, you know, something decomposes, but then it's reused. And from the point of view of materials, and I used to study material flows, materials don't have history. So let's say if you have an atom of iron, it doesn't know if it was a fork before or if it was a tank before, and it doesn't really care. But for us as humans, you know, like it might be interesting to see this kind of evolution and to see this kind of like a stamp, well, not really stamp, but basically, you know, like trace how things evolved. But eventually, yeah, maybe we will also need to have kind of like a circular flows of, you know, materials and energy for those, let's say, artificial digital forms, which again, you know, we started talking autonomy, now we're talking what is life. But yeah.
Yeah, but I don't agree. The problem is that they do have to eat, right? If it's on the Ethereum blockchain and you can't throw it out, it does have to eat, and it is taking up electricity for no good reason, right? Because you could throw it out in the trash now. It's no use to you.
Yes, but it can also hibernate. So if you don't have any miners, it just stays there and it hibernates. And only when you inject energy and more gas, it comes back to life.
Yeah, I would argue.
That's interesting. Yeah, if I can just add my 2 cents. Joe? What's going on?
To argue hibernating doesn't work because the scarce thing we all have is attention.
Yeah, hibernation doesn't work for humans. That's true. What I wanted to say about what you and Grace said about intelligent people not planning on dying, then, well, nobody plans on dying ever. And I would argue that bankruptcy laws are, like what Mikhail said, they're like mechanistic things that are mainly concerned with the fact that money is about to be lost, so about not losing money. So people aren't going to walk away from a company that's bankrupt and leave all the chairs and computers. And I'm pretty sure that people are going to do that for DAOs just so that money doesn't get locked in or lost when the DAO falls apart, which is what you get in blockchain in a much more irreversible way, because with, I don't know, a physical company or even its bank account, you can imagine scavengers getting to that. But a DAO that doesn't die properly in that sense will lose all its money.
So one thing on live here, if you look at cells, they have programmed death. So it's not at the level of an organism. Actually,
but
no,
they
we all have aging.
Not autonomous. Bacteria don't have that, I think.
I mean, bacteria also don't live forever. They just kind of, propagate. But you have those mechanisms.
No, I just mean that for cells, that's a centralized quality. It's because they are cells that they are programmed to die. If you were a bacteria, you wouldn't need that.
But bacteria also don't live forever. So I mean, like, there must be some mechanisms that can't allow you, to grow.
Bacteria
forever.
are cells.
Well,
the word that's coming up for me is autopoiesis.
Yeah.
Apoptosis, right?
Well, basically, the cell will not by itself live forever, at least to my understanding. I don't know of any cases, okay? But the key point there is, like, as we are saying, hibernation doesn't work for humans, but, the computer programs are not humans either, right? And if they're autonomous, they can act kind of by themselves, like, why should they care about humans?
That's lovely, like a company that's dormant until somebody comes back and picks up the cause. Budget's waiting.
Yeah, but again, that company is not human, it's not organic life, and it has, like, different limits to growth and, like, how to function.
No, I'm saying it could work.
It can also work by i.e. by sending it more money or whatever. If that signal isn't sent, and within 30 days thereafter, automatically commit suicide. So there's lots of models you can pursue in order to not needlessly keep something around that no longer has the right value. So it in principle, if you put our mind to it, we can definitely do an intelligent undoing.
That's interesting. Yeah, we're sort of talking about death. I don't know how we got here exactly with autonomy, but I was thinking about what Grace was saying before about fake constructs and stuff. And I think, well, companies and forks aren't that different. That's what I take from Mikhail. And it's basically what we see in things that's eternal. What's eternal about something is the name. So you could, for example, imagine a location that's been used for, I don't know, study for millennia. So it started as a training ground, and over time it evolved into a university and then a modern campus and retained its name, but nothing else. So perhaps some things don't die.
Well, even if you think about, again, if you think about language and names, right, they evolve also to be meaning different things, and words mean different things. I mean, and I think that in many ways you can look at language as kind of these autonomous things. I mean, it's very interesting, right? If you think about, and Holochain talks about that when they talk about what it is that they're doing, is right that I speak English and we're all speaking English, but the English in my head, my database isn't the same as your database. And there's some words none of us know anymore because those words have functionally died. You might still find them in a dictionary, but they've become meaningless. So a name does, you know, names come and go also, and some concepts come into existence and leave. And, you know, so there are things that people are, you know, they're still familiar with, which change, and then if you're in a language which isn't English, and then a new concept comes into the language, and I know I've had that experience, you know, in Hebrew, and because there's an academy, and then there's a new thing like a router, and at the beginning everybody just says router in a Hebrew accent, and then eventually there becomes a word for it, and then everybody uses that word, right? So language keeps evolving, and words are autonomous, and the languages are somewhat semi-autonomous from one another, but then there's certain concepts when we want to communicate them, we need to find the word in parallel languages to communicate with another. So language also has that autonomous kind of, and living and dying, and words have those characteristics about them.
I have a question for the floor. Just from my own the way I perceive things. What do you see, because I'm struggling, as the difference here between what you're describing as autonomy, like in language, and anarchy?
That's a great question.
That's the question.
No, anarchy is absolutely no.
Job, you'll have to turn off your video again because you always freeze.
Yeah. Anarchy is no structure, whereas autonomy can be, you know, like the language example. Language definitely has norms to it, which are forever emergent. So it's a living thing, you know, whereas order. So where there's a lot of order in language, and in fact you can measure the order in language. So I think there's quite a big separation between autonomy and anarchy. Language is just one example where they're actually quite radically different. You know, it's definitely, language is very well ordered in terms of you can measure the expansion in terms of complexity, in terms of number of words, etc., etc. And you can have a society with multiple autonomous organizations without it degrading into anarchy.
I think this question is really central to what it is we're trying to build. I mean, I think it's just a brilliant question. And when I explore that, you know, again, within language or within these DAOs, to me, the difference between autonomy and anarchy is the protocol. Job is pointing to, there's a protocol. In some languages, you got to put the adjective before the noun, and some you got to put the adjective after the noun. And if you do it the opposite way, people will know you're not a native speaker and laugh at you. But and so I think it's a protocol. There's a protocol that you have to follow, and if you don't follow the right protocol in language, maybe people will still be able to compose what you were trying to say. You know, but if you said, you know, the person bit the dog or the dog bit the person, you've got to say that in the right order, otherwise the protocol doesn't work.
No, and that would sort of be anarchistic, and maybe your mistake would catch on and become mainstream. That's another way.
Yeah, and then it would, and then there's also questions, right? So there's this, you know, are the way that, you know, is the way that people speak in the hood acceptable English? Well, it's not acceptable English according to certain tests and the way that they want you to be educated. but it's complete, you know, is it okay to say ain't? And is ain't not a word? And they teach you ain't a word. And that's actually kind of a racist decision. And a random decision, like this is the right English and that is the wrong English.
Well, to be specific, it's AAVE, African American Vernacular English, is actually a separate, like it's its own language. It's a separate dialect with its own grammar rules that are different than English. And they were trying actually in the 90s to get funding to teach Black students as ESL students in Oakland, California. And they were hauled up to Capitol Hill for doing such a thing. But all the research shows that people speaking AAVE are speaking a whole language, and it's not wrong, it's just different than mainstream English.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the official language is never the language.
Yeah, it's a forked protocol is what it is, and it's a forked protocol in and of itself.
I would argue with you when you say that the language is never the language. If you look at French, for example, very clear. French, it's the Académie Française which defines what is the language. At a certain time, it said email is not email, it's courriel. So, you know, it depends on the culture. So the cultural code determines whether there is a formal language which is actually at some level enforced by the sovereign of the country.
Okay.
So
we have a French on the call. I just want to ask him if email is in French, if people use that, and I'm just like, that's a French word for him.
I don't think we have anybody French in the call, but
I just wanted to say that what you're saying is both true and not true, right? Like that academy in France that determines what is French fought, like Parisian French fought a battle with all the other dialects of French to become the predominant dialect. And Manuel de Landa writes about this. He's a material philosopher that I highly recommend in terms of thinking about all the things I've heard discussed so far.
Yeah, but you're talking about 200, the French spoken in Central, in Paris, etc., was competing with Brittany and all the other parts of France, and there was no language. But it's exactly for that reason that the French have this idea of being capable of defining a formal language. It's because of the historical battles that were fought around the language. They went from a relatively anarchistic open system.
Yeah, but they had.
Well, I mean, what's really interesting about this discussion, right, is it really is a discussion about centralization versus decentralization. You know, here's the academy exerting their right, you know, and it's funny that, like, you know, Eyal and I happen to speak one of the newest languages, and still and we have an academy, and still the language isn't the language. And, you know, it's ironic that he would say that because he speaks a very new language. And it's true, like there is this academy trying to tell us what our language is. And up there,
you just call Hebrew one of the newest languages? It
is. Well, the modern Hebrew is very,
modern
very
Hebrew
new.
is
Extremely new. And we have very few irregular verbs, and the slang is extremely new, and there's not much, you know, there hasn't been much, you know, there aren't many dialects.
Most of it is sort of still ancient. So yeah, it's an interesting
But we
example.
don't have people speaking dialects. Like you can kind of tell if somebody's from Haifa, but not really. We don't have dialects yet. You know, there's a few words you can tell if somebody's from Haifa or Jerusalem, maybe, but we don't have dialects because it's so new. But yeah, so that is a really great example that really illustrates decentralization versus centralization, and also really kind of living systems versus these like, you know, institutional systems that we're still saying, oh, the academy gets to decide. I mean, I think it's a really good parallel, but you know, for DAOs.
I think modern Hebrew can be an interesting example for this. For those who doesn't know it, it was not just an academy; it was illegal not to use Hebrew earlier in Israel when they were starting to revive it, and it was really strict and totally ideological. The language, like they were, really working on people not using their native tongues, basically, for everything. And that's why, and the academy had a very central role because they actually had to provide the words because, you know, it was law. So if there was something new, a new technology, a new type of gasoline, they had to release that word so that people can legally refer to that object. You know, crazy times. It worked.
Yeah, well, it related to that. If you think about Esperanto, you know, so in Israel it may have worked, but you look at Esperanto and how many people there were in the early 1900s who were really desperate to see Esperanto work. And there's a museum in Vienna I've been to, and my grandmother was one of the great Esperanto speakers, the leader of the movement in the Netherlands. And you know, it has been a complete failure. So it's actually quite hard to get a system to change, particularly when you're trying to do it very multiculturally, like was the case for Esperanto. So it's a situation that still hasn't completely clarified itself as to what works and what doesn't work.
But I think what is also profound about this, I mean, you know, is that in almost all of the cases we see that you know, that language kind of evolving naturally, except in this one case with Israel, and then, you know, at some point it does become its own living thing, and that's quite unique.
You can think of things like the French colonies and Western colonialism that did very, very serious things to language. Places like Morocco, like, yeah, it's unrecognizable without French today.
Mm.
So I was listening to all those conversations, and it seems that, you know, there's this tension between centralized and decentralized, which is basically, you know, like who's imposing the rules and who has control. And the other one tension is between basically like anarchy versus autonomy, which for me is kind of like rules versus lack of rules. And I mentioned before that, you know, like language evolves, and it evolves internally, but there are also external pressures. So what we have now with those distributed autonomous organizations, they can function by themselves within their external environment, but there is still, you know, like little flexibility for them to evolve and adapt, so they can kind of, you know, like persist and be sustainable. Which again kind of goes back to, you know, like how life persists, because of the discussion about language. For Hebrew, there was certain body that exerted control, and, you know, they centralized it, and it was decided. I mean, like that became the, let's say, the winning version, and that one persists. In other cases, you know, some other cases evolve, like let's say those dialects, or you know, like with English, very different flavors, and as long as people sustain those, you know, they're okay. They might not be accepted, but you can't really weed them out either.
There's this interesting case of Safaricom is a telecom here in Kenya, and they established this e-money system, M-Pesa, and they've tried to do the same thing in other countries, and they've failed over and over again, but it's become ubiquitous here. Every single person, like 99% of the population, is using it. And they were parastatal. They got, you know, they used the bank of the president and all this kind of stuff, and they just had a huge monopoly. And the argument is that they would, for them to compete with other banks and e-money places like in South Africa, it's just nothing can take hold. And so you can't build the critical mass to keep the system alive and, you know, pay for it. I mean, I think that's an interesting model as well, and a little bit kind of like the Israeli one. Like if it was just a bunch of dudes in Israel that were pushing Hebrew, it probably would never have taken off the way it did. I'm sure it wouldn't have. And so it's interesting, like, you know, what kind of space a protocol needs in terms of critical mass to actually survive. And it may not survive on its own ever, or just in pockets.
Yeah, so that, for me, that actually asks or begs to reframe the original question. So, you know, not what is autonomous or not, it's like, but why do we want it autonomous or not? I mean, for decentralized, not decentralized, it's kind of censorship resistant because, you know, like someone can't just switch it off because it's decentralized or at least distributed, right? But why humans would need something that is autonomous?
Go back for a second to the money example. Until now, we have all been able to use cryptocurrency without much problems. But the Financial Action Task Force is an organization that only has 38 countries belonging to it, has pretty much got global power to shut off any country from the financial system. And so we are going to be seeing over the next couple of years the potential death of a whole bunch of financial instruments, you know, currencies, cryptocurrencies, because it becomes possible for 38 countries to rule the remaining 170. So, you know, independence and censor resistance and autonomy, they're all at some level, you know, connected. And you just need to think about something which is clearly not globally legitimate, i.e. an organization which has 38 members is capable of actually dictating the health of, you know, hundreds of different cryptocurrencies.
Yes, that kind of goes back to me to the question of agency. Like, you know, I'm a user of currency, but can I decide the rules about currency? No. And the other thing is, you know, like autonomous versus self-sovereign. I mean, I can issue my own currency and operate it. I mean, other people can tell me to shut it, but it's, in the end, it's up to me whether I shut it down or not.
Not really. The principle can't transfer your money, then it's no use. I mean, the value of money is the ability to transfer it. The Financial Action Task Force is ultimately in control of whether there's going to be any exchange that you can use to transfer your currency. And there are indications that in some countries, even if you run your own wallet, so you don't use a custodian, even then they may well be able to rule what you can and cannot do. So the idea of self-sovereignty is potentially going to hit the wall already as of now. I mean, the Financial Action Task Force has passed these things. It's just a matter that the implementation isn't effective.
Yeah, but the question is, you know, like, can I go outside of the system? And now it would be rather difficult to just go to a place which is not a nation or doesn't have to comply with some kind of, you know, like government rules or legal systems. So I can't really, you know, like go outside of the system, but, you know, like Bitcoin for the time being can circulate independently of, you know, the other payment rails that we have. I mean, yeah, there will be regulators that can chase after you, but it's only because you're embedded in a different system that they control.
Yeah.
Well, it's not
which
just
could
about
be solved
like,
for.
yeah.
I just like I'll give the two examples on this discussion. We're talking about the Pirate Bay and like torrent downloading and other P2P things. You have major, you know, the whole of America basically going after that, and they still haven't been able to take it down unless you're in those nations.
And only because the ISPs are following it. Like if your ISP didn't do it, right? If you didn't have to go through the telecoms and the ISPs. So yeah, and I think that's pretty clear what why you want autonomy. And I think other kinds of global problems like the coronavirus and other things, you can really see how, you know, centralized governance wasn't able to handle these complex problems, and it's only getting worse and more complex. And, you know, you want to have your autonomy as whatever it is, a neighborhood or nation or culture to say, okay, we're going to handle this. And so I think that's why we're talking about autonomy. For me, the question that I think, like the whole discussion, like you were saying, it begs the question, why do we want that? I think we can think of a lot of examples, but to me, it begs the question, what is it that has something that was originally controlled by this academy, right? These languages get free and have their own, like, what is that? How do they kind of come to life? And what are those protocols? Like, what are the characteristics of protocols that, you know, that cause them to become decentralized? And like, that's the question, that's like, what is it? Like, what is the minimum basic protocol that could live on its own? And what is the moment that you release it and stop being controlling of it? Like, how do, you know, how's it come? Yeah.
I think this critical mass thing is huge because it reminds me of this like Tower of Babel kind of, proverb where it's like, yeah, okay, so if you totally decentralize language, well, how would people communicate, right? And so, with currency, the same sort of thing. Like if you were to totally decentralize it and in a way, like Ethereum kind of has done that. You've got your Tron coin, you've got all these coins, and then you have these secondary markets like exchanges that are trying to create protocols between them. And so on the tokens that we are creating, we have a protocol built into them for connection to other tokens, but it is a specific protocol, and enough people have to use it within a communities of communities have to all choose to use that protocol for it to actually work. And we can do that in the space of Kenya because no one else is making competing protocols, right? So we can go, right? So like there's an open space to create a monopoly of that protocol. And, there's a goal in which, you're saying, well, let it be just an uncontrollable or an autonomous kind of machine that, no one has to, be in control of that protocol. But at the same time, like someone has to introduce the protocol for it to be in use. I don't know.
Yeah, if we're talking persistence, I would probably add two more things, which is emergence. I think Job might have mentioned that early on. A lot of the complex systems that we have that function, they have those emergent properties, which can be very complex, but they come ultimately from very simple rules. And the other thing, so there was emergence and fault correction. So one of the things I realized.
Oops, looks like we lost Michal mid-sentence. Did somebody else want to jump in? I see that Kali is unmuted. Did you want to jump in? Nobody wants to jump in. And Michal froze. Everybody froze.
And she's back.
Sorry, I disappeared.
I just wanted to thank Job for answering my question before it really cleared up some things for me. And about what we're talking about, for me it's a lot about power structure. So we said that norms is the difference between autonomy and anarchy. And then, so that's to me is the interfaces. And then what Michal said that really got to me was external pressures. And that definitely finds a place in modern Hebrew, where we discussed, and the external pressures were huge in that context. And I think perhaps that is what begets norms. So if we take a random group of people and just let them interact, then you would find that the interfaces between them, and particularly the external pressures that they exert on each other, would be the inception of norms, of autonomy, perhaps.
I would argue it's actually constraints. Any time you experience constraints, you have to start to optimize other aspects. So it's external pressure is but it's a generic.
This has been a really, like, this conversation has actually been, in some ways, one of the more, like, it's kind of coming full circle and being very much more productive, I think, in some ways than some of our other conversations. I don't really know why. It seemed like such an abstract thing when we started.
Agreed. Weird circles.
Do people have other stuff they want to add to this, or specific things that they're working on where it's relevant? I mean, again, we can kind of. Yeah.
I just like to add on this, where we said, okay, we have these constraints, and I accept what Job said. And then we basically have like how the decision making happens, or what happens, because when you're looking at the null case, a single person, he is both autonomous and in anarchy. But once you have more elements, then you need to think about the power structures and see how things are decided. And then they can become more autonomous or more centralized, which goes back to what you were talking about, Grace, in how such systems can transform, or how can people move between them.
Yeah, and I think
that's just my recap. Yeah.
And I think there's I'm thinking about that in the context, like I'm trying to think in specific context, right? Like, what am I trying to do these days? And I'm very close to declaring the experiment to be complete, because and I think that inside of this conversation, how I can see that's relevant is that we didn't establish enough protocols early enough. And we didn't establish the, I'm going to call it ideology, right? So you said there was like kind of at the beginning. And I think that there is something about, like, you do need to establish those constraints early enough and have enough of a movement within those constraints in order for the protocol to actually work. And I think that that's, we're seeing this kind of uphill push at this point, which is, very not enjoyable at all for me. But, and given that it's a volunteer thing, it has to be fun. So the, I think that that's really like, this is really helpful in looking at what were the constraints that I could have put on that weren't put on, what was the critical mass that we needed at the beginning, as far as, and when I say critical mass is really different in different contexts, but I'm just gonna say enough energy that keeps those constraints in place, because what happened was it was all my energy, and that, that started getting expended pretty quickly. Like, so that enough of a cohesive energy to keep those, whatever protocols or constraints in place in order for something to actually get that first movement. I think that may be kind of what we're pointing at here.
The other thing, Grace, I think that's pertinent here is whether we need a theory of power. Most people do not have a model for the theory of power. So the theory of power, at one level you can think of, was established by Hugo Grotius in 1648 under the Treaty of Westphalia, where that created the idea of a sovereign who could rule all the internal affairs in a country. That model has started breaking down from the late 1800s forward, when we had the robber barons in the US and the unions, or the labor movement, fighting the robber barons. And it has gone full circle, and that we now have organizations like AQ, ISIS, etc., who are extremely good at creating disruption. And in many countries, the battle is really between how much disruption can a minority impose on the majority, and what are they willing to concede in order to have the disruption temporarily stop. But it really is, these days, in many, many countries, it's a very, very small group of people, frequently the haves, who are essentially doing certain things in order to gain concessions, because ordinary people simply can't handle the disruption anymore. So it's a disruption concession cycle, which is increasingly making many conversations go completely haywire.
Agreed, and I'm afraid like we're playing against the laws of physics because it's always easier to go in the direction of disorder.
All right. I mean, I'm kind of feeling like maybe we're wrapping up this discussion of autonomy. Is that how people feel? Do people want to just do a closing round? So, yeah.
I guess for me, there's still always this sort of thing of, how do you develop that consensus among actors to develop an autonomous thing, like a currency or, a group. And there's always a little bit of like kind of social magic there. Like where it works best for us is when we're going into an existing group like a church or a women's circle or something like this, where they've already got that sort of thing. But when you're trying to build, larger scale, cohesion, and it's just a difficult thing. That bootstrapping, into autonomous kind of units that work together. It's interesting.
Yeah, for me, that really touches on our, it's interesting because, the more you look at these things about it, it's also about mindset, right? It touches on our individualistic mindset and our tribal mindsets, and people's, I'm going to say people are unaccustomed to thinking as humanity. And even when you point out, hey, this global health crisis touches us as humanity, it's just a mindset switch that is so difficult for people to make. So.
I'll just say, if I'm thinking about like the autonomous system, the successful autonomous systems that I know for humans, then it's really about values, about alignment of values, because then you can have that that minimal constraint. Those people who are keeping that thing alive, or just making sure that the electric bill gets paid, and you have that minimum thing, that critical mass, and beyond that, like huge freedom that is able to inspire people to take that up. And I think the value is there is what's able to create consistency and make sure that an establishment keeps doing what it's doing. And maybe that relates to what I said earlier about the name, where you can just hang a name over a place and say, this is a place dedicated for X, and then have all sorts of things move through that who are dedicated to X. And it could be sustainable if autonomous agents become inspired enough to sustain the system themselves. Like to take up the cause from those who are maintaining that MVP that's required for it to be there for new people.
Hey, did you guys see this movie, The Platform? It's a Spanish movie.
No.
No. Maybe watch it. It's really gory. You can fast forward through some of the horror part of it, but it's pretty interesting. Maybe we can have a discussion about it another day.
It's called The Platform.
The Platform, yeah. It's kind of science fiction, and basically the idea is like they're experimenting to see when people will sort of spontaneously form, altruism in a way that maintains this kind of system that they've built. It's a very dystopic kind of vision, but it's very interesting. It's Spanish with subtitles, but I loved it. I love the ending of it.
Okay, thanks for sharing. From my point of view, yeah, I mean, like a lot of those discussions are circles, and sometimes the circles don't close. So I have a lot of other questions there. Well, I really resonate with you with the difficulty of bootstrapping something that like can survive, and like the key question is how do you get to the first stable version? Like whether that's a community or a platform or like a business and so on. And the other thing is like very much about the balance. So there's this balance between something being able to sustain versus something being resilient. And always, if you go too far in one direction, like it has massive side effects. But this balancing game is just like very, very tricky. And the final thought is, like Elon Musk is worried about AI being malicious. I'm starting to worry that maybe DAOs with AI would be even worse. But yeah, I probably have other things to worry about now.
The interesting point about whether getting to the first station is actually worthwhile. There's a lot of argument around that a classic Nash equilibrium isn't good enough. You need to look at an evolutionary stable strategy, something that can actually reasonably have a life going through the cycles. So it's again, what is the thing? What level of order are we looking for? And I think we're really looking for an evolutionary stable strategy, which is a quite well-defined concept, which has similar principle to a Nash equilibrium. So it's an interesting question. Thanks so much.
Grace, you're on mute.
Yeah, I know. It's a really great call today. Thanks everybody for participating. This turned out to be just really, I don't know, this was one of my favorite calls. And next week, we're going to be talking about free riders and rent seekers and how do you deal with that in a decentralized organization. So that should be a juicy conversation for next week. So
thank you, everybody.
Again.
It's been a
All
pleasure.
right.
Thank you, everyone.
Ciao. All right. Bye.
Take care.